Hey everyone, Jake Lloyd-Bacon here.
Along with Paul Bianchi.
And Alexandra Hoy.
Hey, we all host different shows on Dragon Wagon Radio.
We do, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
Not at all. We are here to talk about Dungeons and Dragon Wagon,
a narrative podcast series in which we venture into a mythical land for a D&D inspired role-playing game.
Alexandra and I are joined by Matt Hinksman and a very special guest of quest for each chapter of an epic saga in which we must take on the roles of half-orcs, dark elves, and more as we fight our way through a fantastical land of peril, drama, and often hilarity.
All of which is controlled by me, the Dungeon Master, and the player's chance rolls of the die.
And our show is for everyone. Even if you know nothing about D&D or role-playing games, we've got you covered.
That's right. Our game sessions are highly edited, easy to follow, sound designed from top to bottom, and completely immersive.
Yeah, our episodes sound more like a well-produced radio drama than an RPG show.
So what are you waiting for? Join the adventure on Dungeons and Dragon Wagon at dndwpod.com or wherever you find great podcasts.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers, to another exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. I'm your host, Stephen Sable, and welcoming back to the studio here for another exciting program is my friend and yours, Dr. Earl Showerman. Earl, good to have you back.
Such a pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.
You know, the last time we were together, Earl, we talked a little bit about Shakespeare's medical knowledge, but I asked you to come back today to talk about something a little different, something that's definitely in your wheelhouse. You know, among Oxfordians, those of you who are regular listeners, and maybe you yourselves have now become an Oxfordian, you will know, and if you haven't known this, you will come to know that Earl is our Greek master. He is the guy who has spent a great deal of the last 15 years of his life studying Shakespeare's Greek references, the influence of the Greek masters upon the works of Shakespeare. And today he's going to talk to us a little bit about one of the most popular plays ever, and that is the Scottish play. I never understood that whole superstition of not saying Macbeth. Even as a theater artist, I just never bought into that. It's called Macbeth. We'll call it Macbeth.
We're safe.
We're safe. We're not in a theater. So some people say it only counts if you're in a theater. Some people say it only counts if you say it and you're not actually working on a performance of it. And, you know, if you do any real research into that, one of the reasons why Macbeth is thought to be this cursed play is because there are quite a number of stories throughout history where horrible things have happened during productions or during rehearsals for productions of that play. Well, the truth of the matter is it has nothing to do with a curse on the play or Shakespeare actually using ritualistic incantations or witchcraft or any of that. It's actually because the play is the shortest tragedy. It is one of the most popular plays in the canon. It is one of the most, outside of Midsummer Night's Dream, it is the most popularly produced play in the canon. And one of the reasons why so many terrible things have happened during performances or rehearsals is because a lot of those productions have been either under-rehearsed or underfunded or thrown together last minute by a theater company that was going under and needed to come up with a moneymaker. And so when you do things under those circumstances, yeah, people get stabbed accidentally, people fall off of stairways, like things can happen when you aren't fully prepared and not properly paying attention to safety and those kinds of things. And so the whole idea that there's this curse around the play is truly a superstition based in fact, but fact that comes from negligence, not from witchcraft.
Well, I think your analysis is quite accurate. And when you're saying that it's such a popular play and produced more frequently than other plays other than Midsummer Night's Dream would increase the probability that some mishap might occur. And then that would become part of the apocryphal mythopoetic element that governs the superstitions around this play. But this play itself is full of superstitious and magical and mystical and terrifying elements. And I think the idea that it is the most classical of all of Shakespeare's plays, and that's been noted by a number of scholars in terms of it's the darkness of it and the terror that's associated with it, has something to do with the fact that it has caused such an emotional reaction in its audiences and its popularity in that regard, and then the apocryphal problems of all the mishaps that occur with productions, and the fact that you don't mention the name of the play itself.
But in your research, what you've come upon, and something that's fascinating to me, especially because I am a big theater guy and I do love the Greeks. In fact, I have produced and directed quite a number of the Greek tragedies. A lot of people shy away from the Greek tragedies, but I think that we really need to embrace them as theater artists and as lovers of literature, because so much of what we know today came from there and came from that basis. And I've always argued that if you look at the writers of the Elizabethan era, who did they have to study in order to learn their craft? They certainly didn't have them. We now have them. We can now study Shakespeare. We can study Johnson. We can, we have them to study. But who did they have to study?
Well, that's a bone of great contention here in terms of who influenced Shakespeare in terms of his dramatic vision. I mean, I think most scholars would stick to the Latinate sources, primarily Seneca, and Plautus, of course, would be the other, and Terence be the authors of the comedies as inspirations for Shakespeare. But very few 20th and 21st century scholars would tread on that thin ice that suggests that Shakespeare was influenced by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, let alone Aristophanes. But I think that in our conversation today, we will cover some of that ground. I think that the idea that Shakespeare whoever wrote the works, and you and I agree completely that Edward de Vere is a far greater candidate in this regard. The idea that he was reinventing a dramatic form, a realistic drama, 2,000 years after it had faded from existence, with the downfall of Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War and around 400 BC, that he would have been using those themes, those elements of plot and dramaturgy and image and rhetoric, that it's delving into those Greek sources is a fascinating subject, I think, that Oxfordians can feast on, whereas most traditional scholars would try to stay away from that, because the fact that most of these plays, virtually all of Aeschylus's plays, were never translated or published in England during Shakespeare's lifetime, and that only a handful of plays by Sophocles and Euripides entered into the English sphere at that time. These plays were popular in the continent, but not in England necessarily during the 16th century that most of these plays were thought to have been written.
Well, and Stratfordians want to stay away from the idea that the author of the plays could have had access to any of these plays, these ancient master plays, in their original Greek or in their early Latin translations, because they don't want to paint their guy as needing to know Greek and Latin. And what, of course, we believe and what we will constantly put forth is that it's obvious that the author of these plays did know Greek and did know Latin quite well.
I think you're absolutely right. I don't think that most traditional Shakespeare scholars would deny Shakespeare's knowledge of Latin sources. And in fact, Jonathan Bate has just published a book, How the Classics, made Shakespeare, basically, and looking at all the Latin sources within Shakespeare, going beyond the dramatists Seneca and Plautus, but including Horace and Cicero and Lucan and other Latin writers during that time. And I think the Stratford Grammar School education, we don't have their curriculum, would have had some basis in Latin. It's possible that he would have read Ovid's Metamorphoses in his grammar school. However, only about half the grammar schools had one copy of Metamorphoses. And if you look at the inventories of the grammar schools, there was no universal curriculum, which is what a lot of Shakespeare traditional scholars, going back to T.W. Baldwin and most recently by Carol Rudder in the Shakespeare Beyond Doubt book, have claimed that there was mostly a universal education, that it would have been deeply immersed in Latin scholars. And I think the inventories of the schools that we do have access to suggest that no, those reading lists were really limited, and there was no universal education in that regard. So But we have to give them the Latin. We can't say that the traditional scholars would deny in any regard. But with Greek, you have a big problem. And the most recent scholar that has looked at this seriously is a woman named Tanya Pollard, who's a professor at Brooklyn College, and her Bainton award-winning book, Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages, is an outstanding look at the possibility that Shakespeare was profoundly influenced by Euripides, whose works were more popular at that time. And of course, we have more than double the number of plays from Aeschylus and Sophocles by Euripides. He was more popular and writing more realistic dramas. And there's evidence that many scholars have looked at in terms of Euripidean influence on Shakespeare. But today we're kind of interested in talking about the influence of the Oresteia, in particular, the first play of that trilogy, the Agamemnon, on Macbeth.
So tell us what you have found.
Well, let me start by going back and indicating that I was a student at the Lifelong Learning Program at Southern Oregon University. And in 2009, so 10 years ago, I had taken a class in which we read, over a 10-week period, the Oresteia, the only extant trilogy of Aeschylus, which is the Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and the Eumenides. And so we were doing a deep read of Robert Fagel's most recent translation. He's actually done several translations of that trilogy, and with supplemental materials from other plays, other translations as well, to see how other translators were translating Aeschylus. And he's quite metaphoric in his language, and the translations vary quite a bit in their poetic quality. In any case, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival that year produced an incredible version of Macbeth that was done in the classical style. And seeing the play during the time that I was taking this class, I was struck by the number of images, plot elements, and other aspects of those plays that were exactly similar. I went home that night after seeing the play and wrote down at least a dozen different things that I wanted to take a look at. And when I went back to class the next time, I asked around, and so many of the other students noted also the similarities in plot, in characterization, in elements that referred to, for instance, the bird augury that was there, that's in Aeschylus and so on. So I took the next 6 months to do further investigations on this question and discover that, unlike Hamlet, where a number of scholars have really tied Hamlet to the Oresteia, no single scholar had ever done a systematic look at the plot elements and other qualities of Macbeth in comparison with the Oresteia of Aeschylus. And I think that my paper, which was published in Brief Chronicles in 2011, Volume 3, is a definitive exploration of that argument. And I would encourage our readers to go take a look at that on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, if they're curious after they're hearing our conversation today.
Okay, when you think about a king of Scotland, you don't immediately think of Greek mythology, right? It's not a natural connection that most people would go to. And truthfully, it's possible that we have listeners who, when you talk about the Oresteia, meaning that trilogy of plays that talk about the life of Orestes, that's who we're talking about, is Orestes. And give us a little bit of that so that people who are listening can kind of get a feel for what it is that we're talking about.
Well, of course, the Oresteia doesn't have Orestes in the first drama, actually. The Agamemnon is the story of Agamemnon's return from Troy with Cassandra in tow, and being welcomed by Clytemnestra in a very clever way that belies her intent to murder him, similarly to where Lady Macbeth belies her welcome mat to King Duncan when he comes to visit her. And the play ends with the assassination of Agamemnon and Cassandra by Clytemnestra, who is the primary actor in this regard. She's assisted by her lover, Aegisthus, in the killing of her husband. And the play concludes with her claiming her righteous right to have murdered her husband, who caused the sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia, at the outset of the Trojan War 10 years earlier. So, and
one of the best plays ever, by the way.
Yes,
I believe, and it's hardly ever done, and it's because nobody really knows it. But Iphigenia is one of the most heart-wrenching stories of all of the Greeks.
It was the most popularly translated play in the early Renaissance. Also, there were several translations of the Iphigenia to Aulis.
I long to produce and direct that play. Maybe it may take as long as the point where my eldest daughter will be old enough to play that role, and then I can play Agamemnon. But yeah, that is definitely one of the greatest stories of them all. And that sets into motion all these other stories that we're talking about now.
It does. So the libation bearers, or the Choephori, the second play in the trilogy, is the story of Orestes' return and being recognized by his sister Electra, and then plotting the revenge murder of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, which he performs at the end of the play. And then but then the Furies show up immediately at the very end of that tragedy, the second part of this trilogy, and he runs off the stage, basically being pursued by the Furies. The part 3, the Eumenides, which is the translated name for the Furies who become the friends of man at the very end, is the story of Orestes taking sanctuary at the Apollo's temple at Delphi, and being advised by Hermes at that time to go to Athens and to seek the protection of Athena and to be tried at the Areopagus. And so the final play of this is the trial of Orestes for the murder of Clytemnestra, with the Furies acting as the prosecutors and Apollo being Orestes' attorney who represents him. And in the final vote, the jury splits over whether he's guilty or innocent of the murder of his mother. Athena casts the deciding vote, which is to exonerate Orestes for his justifiable homicide, and then to invite the Eumenides, the Furies, to become the friends of Athens, and offers them sanctuary there, which then gets taken up, of course. That's all part of the plot of Oedipus at Colonus, one of Sophocles' late dramas. So it all ties together, and it's very interesting that Aeschylus, in writing this drama, was concurrent in terms of the Areopagus being a place where criminal trials actually took place in Athens. So there's an historic topicality that Aeschylus takes advantage of in this particular drama.
Okay, now take us to 1050 Scotland and how these stories reflect one another.
Well, the idea that King Duncan comes to the Macbeth's castle and is murdered there is parallel to the plot of King Agamemnon coming to his home and being murdered there also. So there's parallels in the idea of a royal assassination under a roof in which they should have been protected. So Macbeth says, he is my guest double. He's not only, I'm only his host, but he's my liege lord. And in murdering him, I'm violating, the concept that was very significant and deep within the Greeks, and that is that you offer hospitality to visitors. And
he's here in double trust.
In double trust, yeah. So, the sources of the Scottish sources, the Scottish history sources, came from Holinshead, and prior to him from Boethius, the story of Macbeth and his wife, and the assassinations and all that. So he derives the primary plot actually from Holinshead Chronicles, which were published in 1578, and then another edition came out in the 1580s.
And except for a couple of name changes and swooshing the years together, which Shakespeare was very fond of doing. I mean, Julius Caesar, the stories that happen in that play actually take place over many, many years, but he just kind of crunches time together. And he does that a lot with the history plays too, where he just crunches time.
Right.
Which the Greeks would have gone nuts over, by the way, right? Like, what are you doing?
Yes.
But the story itself of Macbeth is pretty close. He does a few name changes, he crunches some time, but it's pretty accurate as far as what happens and who does what to whom, except when you look at this sort of Greek connection that overlays the story, right?
Well, I think it enriches and deepens the story, and the tragical consequences and the terrifying aspects of this when you introduce the weird sisters. It brings in that supernatural element that is mentioned in Holland's Head. Holland's Head does mention the prophecy of these weirds, of the weird sisters, which are derived primarily from the Anglo-Saxon Celtic triple feminine deities, who were like the Fates. But the Greeks also had the triple goddess. They had the triple Gorgons, and the new Gorgon is mentioned when Macbeth sees the assassinated king. He refers to see the new Gorgon, and there were 3 Gorgons, of course, Medusa being the one that we are most familiar with. But there were the Fates, the Greek Fates were the triple goddesses. So the triple goddess theme runs both through the mythopoetic elements within the Greek and Roman tradition as well as in the Northern tradition. So that was, he combines those elements and makes the witches. And of course, the what we call witches, they were actually the weird sisters, the way they're described and most referred to in the text, were beholden to Hecate. Mm-hmm. She appears in Act 3 or 4 of the play, and they are terrified of her. And she is the one that helps govern and to guide them. And Hecate, of course, is the goddess, is a Greek goddess, and associated with the moon and sorcery and witchcraft and death. So she's appropriately placed there, but it's an integration.
There's sort of a triad to her personality as well.
That's correct.
As a Greek goddess.
No doubt about it. But the classical elements that tie the Macbeth story to the Greek Oresteia, and I'm speaking specifically about the Agamemnon here primarily, the first of those plays, are specific images. For instance, as Macbeth is considering what would happen if he killed Duncan, he says, if I could trammel up the consequence. He uses the word trammel. Trammel is a word that means net, but it was an incredibly rare word. It's only used once in the entire Shakespeare canon, and in this instance. Well, trammel is also a word for a fishing net. It's also used for the bindings that were used to secure King Henry VIII and his first wife, Mary, Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor. So the description of how their bodies were wrapped around, they used the word trammel. But trammel is also a net, and that word trammel is used in several translations of the.
Do you mean Catherine? Henry VIII's first wife was Catherine.
Catherine, yes. Excuse me.
Bloody Mary is his daughter from Catherine.
Oh my goodness, yes.
That's right.
Oh, when she died, also it was Catherine and Mary. They were both described as being wrapped in a trammel. Okay, so these incredibly rare words. I think Robert Greene uses the word trammel also in the Menaphon in 1589, but those are the only usages of that word. Well, when you think of the Agamemnon as a source, the trammel is the net that Clytemnestra throws upon Agamemnon at the time that she assassinates him during his bath. She describes exactly throwing a heavy net or robe upon him, and the word trammel is used in several translations. So it is the image of a large, heavy fishing net that was used to secure him and immobilize him so that they could stab him while he was in his bath. So that word trammel comes up in a very loaded sense. And at the end of the Agamemnon,
it gives me images of gladiators in combat,
yes,
and some of those gladiators who used a net and a trident.
That's the image. And at the very end of the Agamemnon, Clytemnestra comes out and holds up the bloody sword. Oh, have we seen bloody swords in Macbeth several times?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. The image is this a knife, a dagger I see before me, and of course the bloody knives that are.
Why did you bring them from the place?
That's right. Well, Clytemnestra comes out with a bloody sword and displays it to the chorus at the end of the Agamemnon, and then holds up the net that she used to kill him. And at the end of the libation bearers, Orestes brings out those two elements again, both the net and the sword that was used to kill his father, to demonstrate them to them. So the net and the sword go together, and Shakespeare maybe playing on that when he uses the word trammel up the consequence, and bring him success and make him take over as king from Duncan by using that. So we'll talk a little bit about the elements that bind Queen Clytemnestra to Lady Macbeth. I think these are very, very similar characters. Let me mention the fact that both of them have night terrors. Lady Macbeth, of course, in Act 5, she's really falling apart. She has the out damn spot speech. She has candles lit around her all the time. she is haunted by the terrible things that have transpired under her roof. And Clytemnestra very similarly has a terrifying dream that awakens her during the night. She has candles lit throughout the castle during that night. And so the idea of night terrors and sleeplessness are similar in the fact that both queens demand that lights be lit at nighttime in their chambers is a dramaturgic parallel that binds these two together. The other thing that's very obvious is the theme of the poisoned breast. Lady Macbeth says that Macbeth is too full of the milk of human kindness, and she calls on the ministers of evil to make her breast milk like gall.
Take my milk for gall.
Take my milk for gall. And then she mentions plucking the suckling babe from her breast and smashing its brain if she were obliged to do what Macbeth had. So in three ways, three different images, you find the idea of the mother's milk, the breast being a poison and not healthy. Well, that theme certainly is there in the Libation Bearers, where Clytemnestra is awakened by her dream from this night terror, and she imagined that she bore a child in the form of a serpent, who then she put in swaddling clothes and put to her breast, and the serpent bit her breast. And that's her prophetic knowledge that she's going to be killed later by her son, that she has some prophecy, some terrifying prophecy based on this unusual dream of the poisoned breast. Shakespeare uses this image again in Antony and Cleopatra. If you look at the historical source of the suicide of Cleopatra that comes from Plutarch's Lives, she actually applies the asp to her arm, whereas in Shakespeare's play, she puts the asp to her breast.
And most of popular world believes it to be the way Shakespeare characterized it and dramatized it in his play.
That's right.
Because most of the world, that's their only reference to it. She clutched an asp to her breast, right? Because they haven't read Plutarch's Lives.
Right.
And they don't know that there's another instance where he changed history, as it were, through his dramatization of a historical event.
But the idea of a poisoned breast comes from the old Greek model. And the idea that the breast would be a symbol of our humanity. For instance, in the Iliad, before Hector goes out to his death to battle Achilles, Hecuba shows her breast to her son, says, these breasts, I suckled you on these breasts. Do not go out into the field of battle today because you will probably die, battling Achilles. So he ignores that advice. So the idea of the exposed breast is a theme that
he says, oh, Mom, really? Come on. I didn't need to see that.
I doubt that he was that embarrassed, but he was compelled to. His destiny was to confront Achilles, of course. Yeah. So those are some of the themes that bind them together. But both Clytemnestra and Lady Macbeth are incredibly strong characters. Very strong, highly destructive female characters.
She is actually, as far as the size of the role, not a very large role at all, but one of the most coveted roles among female Shakespearean actors that I have ever seen.
Yes.
When you announce that you're holding auditions for that play, they come out of the woodwork to play that role. I mean, women want to play that role with a severe desire. That and Kate. Everybody wants to play Kate in Taming of the Shrew. I've never understood that she's also not it's not a very large role. Everybody wants to play Lady Macbeth or Kate.
Well, these women are very powerful, both with their language and their influence on the people around them.
Yes.
Kate terrifies everybody around her except for Tricky, of course.
And Lady Macbeth terrifies everybody in the audience.
And convinces Macbeth he needs to do something that he had thought about, that had been prophesied by the Weird Sisters. Talk a little bit more about the Weird Sisters in that regard, because they are like a chorus, like a Greek chorus. They act like the Fates. They prophesy Macbeth's future. Then they seduce him and terrify him with their further prophetic images. The idea of the cauldron in which they mix, that's a very classical image. Tisiphone, one of the Fates, or Furies, is associated with a cauldron to mix magic elements and all that. So the whole cauldron scene kind of refers to them. And in the Oregon Shakespeare Festival production in 2009, the Weird Sisters would hang by the side of the stage, kind of observing the action, even though they weren't included in those particular acts. They would appear kind of to be influences on what was going on there. So in some regard, the idea of the Greek chorus is being fulfilled by the Weird Sisters in Macbeth.
What about the parallels to the oracle at Delphi and the whole idea of like breathing in the fumes from the fissure of the earth as opposed to a cauldron, and then delivering these prophecies that are enigmatic and sort of riddle based, right? I would say that there's that connection too. Would you agree?
I would definitely agree. I mean, the Oracle of Delphi never gave a clear
Never.
Although they did say that when the Persians came to Athens, the oracle said that the Persians would not breach the wooden walls. Well, the Persians burned Athens, but the wooden walls were the navy. They were the walls of the ships that the Greeks defeated the Persian at Salamis, which was the definitive battle at the end of the Persian and Greco wars, and sent the Persians packing finally after, they'd come to Marathon. 10 years later, they end up at Salamis. Finally, the Spartans assist them in defeating them at Plataea, but it was the wooden walls of their ships that they interpreted the Oracle Delphi.
I think the only oracle answer that is pretty clear in any literature reference is in Winter's Tale.
Yes.
When they return from the oracle to reveal that and to say to Leontes, she's innocent, she is not guilty, and he goes, I don't believe that. It's the clearest answer the oracle ever gives ever, and Leontes goes, no, that's there. You can't trust them.
Of course, catastrophe follows immediately. His son dies.
Right.
There's a terrible thing, another sudden death that Shakespeare describes, an offstage death. And of course, both Macbeth and Agamemnon are murdered offstage in the Greek manner. They're not murdered on stage. Of course, Hermione faints and then is presumed dead for the next 16 years because of the Paulinus intelligence and how to manage all that. But his refusal. Now in Macbeth, besides the Weird Sisters, the oracular material comes through bird divination. In a conversation between Ross and another character, they talk about the fact that the day before the assassination, a falcon in its pride of place had been attacked and killed by a mousing owl. Now, pride of place in falconry is the highest point in the sky that a falcon ascends to immediately before their lightning swift descent and attack on their prey. Owls hunt close to the ground. They swoop down over the ground and usually are killing rodents, mice, rats, small animals. They do not fly high in the sky. So the idea that an owl would have sent to the highest point in the sky that a falcon flies and kills a falcon is a very ominous sign. The Greeks totally believed I shouldn't say totally believed, their mythology represents a sincere belief in avian augury. They have a word for that. I think it's oinomatopia. But it has to do with the fact that their sense of divinations came from the oracles, came from their prophetic dreams they have. And the third element of their prophecy had to do with the behavior of birds. If the birds were flying from the right to the left, that was a propitious good sign. That's mentioned, for instance, at the beginning of the Agamemnon. They talk about the twin brothers, Menelaus and Agamemnon, who's setting off for sea. There's two eagles that accompany them and fly with them. They also cause a problem because the eagles descend and attack a pregnant hare, which offends Artemis, and that is the cause of the sacrifice that Iphigenia has to make. That Agamemnon has to sacrifice his daughter because Artemis is offended by the killing of the rabbit, the pregnant rabbit, by these two eagles that were part of them.
I thought it was that the soldiers were forbidden to hunt the deer.
There's two stories.
Okay.
There's several versions of this, but the one that I'm familiar with is that those eagles attacked a pregnant hare, and that Calchas, the seer,
In Julius
interprets that.
Caesar, birds are mentioned quite often.
There's the twin eagles, yes.
as forms of augury. In fact, when Cassius and Brutus get together before the battle, they talk about how the birds were prior to arriving here. We had eagles, and
Two
now
eagles.
we have crows.
That's right.
Or kites.
Crows, kites, chuffs, those are all from the raven and crow family. You're right.
And Macbeth loves to talk about birds.
And he talks about birds. There's at least a dozen birds mentioned in
including
Macbeth.
chuffs, which I have to constantly direct actors on how to pronounce that and explain to them what a chuff is.
Yes. So avian augury enters in several elements within that, and that's a very Greek quality. You know, you see that in Greek drama and Greek myth and other narratives. The other one of the other aspects that is very Greek in this regard is the
another thing with regards to birds is, of course, later on Aristophanes shows up and he writes a whole play called The Birds.
Oh my goodness, yes. and I will, when we talk about Midsummer Night's Dream later this year, I will talk about the parallels between Dream and Aristophanes, The Birds, because I think there's incredible parallels that are worth our listeners knowing a little bit about. But I got to save that for another conversation,
okay.
Stephen. Okay. So I've been thinking about other elements that are classical elements within.
There is an owl. An owl shrieks at the time of the murder as well. And one of the Weird Sisters, and I love how the Weird Sisters have familiars in the play. It's very subtle references, but when they gather together, they suddenly each hear their animal familiars call out to them. And one of them is an owl.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that, and there is that screeching owl that's probably a barn owl. Can you imagine the sense of this white bird sailing through on midnight on a full moon, screeching like that? It would be chilling.
A lot of mythological references to owls that include that they come to claim the spirits or the souls of the dead.
Yes. Now, one other thing I was going to mention is the idea that the house itself has a language, that there is an intelligence and a memory in the stones that Macbeth walks on. He talks about these stones will remember my stepping on them on my way to that. And then sleep no more. I thought I heard a voice say sleep no more. Okay. And then Lady Macbeth, of course, being sleepless and all. So the destruction of sleep, that idea that the house has a language comes directly from the Greek source. The Furies are identified in the Agamemnon as singing songs of destruction within the house itself. The house itself the castle itself has a language that is part of that tragic formulation that affects that. So the idea, and Hamlet, of course, has this swear coming from the coast.
The cellarage. The old boy in the cellarage.
That's it. So the idea that there's an animating principle within what we consider to be inanimate object, like a house or a sword or some other thing like that, to the Greeks, these things still had memory, still had agency, still had a voice that could be discovered or expressed if you knew how to extract that.
Do you think they were predicting quartz tape? Think about that for a second.
Okay.
Right? Because isn't that what old cassette tapes and videotapes were made out of? It was made out of quartz.
Oh,
right? That's a stone with memory, isn't it?
Okay, there you go.
How about that?
Well, that's a metaphor I hadn't thought about.
There you go. There's a new one.
All right. So one other thing that we're talking about in terms of the Greek sources is the idea that Macbeth says that his hands are so stained with the blood of Duncan that it would turn the green seas incarnadine?
Incarnadine, yes.
Incarnadine, yeah. Turn it red.
Turning the green one red.
And
the multitudinous seas.
The multitudinous seas. Claudius uses the same idea. He says all the rivers, all the springs, all the rains could not wash his hands clean of the contamination from having assassinated his brother, the king. So he uses that same metaphor. All the perfumes in Arabia cannot sweeten or remove the smell of blood from Lady Macbeth's hands. The idea that the hands with this blood is an indelible stain on their soul, that comes from the Agamemnon, and the Clytemnestra has blood splattered on her from her assassination, and that mark is described as being something that could never be cleaned, could never be cleansed or purified again, that once you've shared that kind of blood, so that the sea, all the waters, all the oceans, all the rivers could not clean that the stain of that sin, is a Greek element that comes into both Shakespeare's great Northern tragedies, Hamlet and Macbeth. So that's another one of those elements. And of course, we have ghosts. In Hamlet, we have it in Macbeth, the ghost of Banquo. And in the Oresteia, the ghost of Clytemnestra comes to the Furies in the third part, in the Eumenides, and chides them for not having pursued Orestes to Athens, and says, you must go pursue him. They were put to sleep by Apollo when they arrived at the Delphic oracle in pursuit of Orestes, who had taken refuge there. And that's how Orestes was kind of led out of there without having to deal. He sneaks away because the Furies are put to sleep. But it's the ghost of Clytemnestra that comes to arouse them. We see images of this on Greek vases. It was a very popular idea. So the idea of these revenge ghosts are in both Hamlet and Macbeth and the Oresteia. So that's another
I love
one.
how Apollo seems to, he kind of gives Orestes a get out of jail free card in acknowledgement of him avenging his father's death.
Right.
But yet the Furies are there to say, but he has committed one of the worst sins. He has committed parenticide. He has killed his own mother, which gave him life. And so I think that whole interesting, the Greeks were so good at like throwing in these interesting twists of relationships with people. And when you think about how one play ties to another play, we have Electra, which is this same story where Electra and Orestes kill Clytemnestra at the end of that play. All beginning with Paris taking Helen off to Troy.
It actually goes back several more generations. Agamemnon's father Atreus and his brother had a disagreement over who should be the king. And it was the brother who had an affair with his wife, stole the sacred, I think there was a fleece that was the significator of the king, and that caused the sun to rise in the west, a very inauspicious sign. And eventually Atreus murders his brother's sons and serves them in a banquet that is in his honor.
Kind of like Titus Andronicus.
Yeah, and it's the nephew that comes back in as the co-murderer with Clytemnestra that kills Agamemnon. So we have generations of sin. The house of Atreus is a cursed house in the Greek tradition. It goes back 3 generations. So it's an inherited sin. Orestes is the one who will settle the matter and remove the curse, okay? That he will stand trial. And he does not deny that he killed his mother. And Apollo's argument is nuanced. He says, well, Orestes is the son of the father. The mother, she was merely the basket that held the seed the father planted in her. She's really not related to him.
Apollo is definitely not Jewish then.
He's not Jewish. He's not a feminist either. No. So he gives a rather arcane argument that Orestes really didn't murder his mother. She merely was the one that held the father's seed that became who Orestes is. So it's an argument that no doctor would accept very well today. But at that time, the idea that the paternal line was the primary source of your power.
I guess when you're the son of Zeus, you can take that kind of direction
right.
with it.
Well, the Greeks had a lot to do with their ancestral inheritance. I mean, how many hundreds of heroes define themselves as descendants of Hercules? And that would include Mark Antony and Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was certain that one of his ancestors was Hercules, and Mark Antony claimed that Antonius was one of those bastard sons of Hercules that was his ancestor. So they all claimed some descent from him. And Hippocrates claimed descent from Asclepius on his father's side and from Hercules on his mother's side. So the Greeks had a whole thing about the power of the male inheritance. So that was
They all wanted
a
to be
big-
attached to Zeus in some way or another.
No. So anyway, the idea of insanity also is a very Greek idea that we've talked previously in a previous podcast about Shakespeare's representation of madness, but certainly there's a madness that occurs because of these supernatural powers that come that affect Lady Macbeth. Certainly is this case, and Clytemnestra's behavior and her obsession with this prophetic destructive dream that she has is really unnerves her. And of course, Orestes shows signs of madness in Euripides' play Orestes. He starts in a frenzy, in an absolute anxiety-driven frenzy of activity, and he's pretty much insane in his activities. And at the end of the play, he captures Hermione, the daughter of Menelaus and Helen, and holds a knife against her neck and threatens to kill her unless they're let to go free by the people who want to kill Orestes at that time. So there's a variety of madness that's represented in the Greek plays that enters into Shakespeare's concepts as well. So there's the parallels in theme and in some plot elements and in certainly the images that we've talked about certainly draw attention to the fact that Macbeth seems to be, and several classical scholars have said it's his most classical play. It's the closest thing he ever wrote to Greek tragedy because of its simplicity of plot, the fact that evil is so obvious from the get-go, and then is so laden with irony within the play itself that, a Lady Macbeth seducing Duncan with the kind of language was so much like Clytemnestra seducing Agamemnon with her language. So I think that Shakespeare used the power of the Greek drama to amplify the sense of evil and supernatural terror that you get in a play like Macbeth.
Well, she uses her powers of seduction to get the guards drunk as well.
Right.
Right. I will ply them with wassail, she says.
Yes.
She obviously uses that same power of seduction when it comes to seducing her husband into the deed.
Right.
She is definitely the catalyst of the play, of the entire play. There's a common argument, especially when you're producing or directing a production of the play, as to whether or not the Weird Sisters are the catalyst or they're just the observers who are reporting, and how much of that involves Hecate and what she chides them. She says, "How dare you interfere with the lives of mortals without my permission?"
Yes.
And they say, "But it's so good." And she goes, "Okay, you're right. You're forgiven. It is so good." But that doesn't necessarily mean that they caused it to happen, that they've made these things happen. The way I've always interpreted it is that those ill intentions within the human bring about these evil spirits. Like they call them forward with, and most specifically, Lady Macbeth calls them forward. And I have produced a production of this play where I began the play as the opening scene begins with Lady Macbeth over a gazing bowl, sort of conjuring these spirits to assist her with her ambitions. No lines. I don't add words. I don't rewrite Shakespeare. Just a visual of her, like, sort of incanting over this gazing bowl right before that first scene opens up, so that it makes it very clear that she is the catalyst of the entire thing. It's her ambition. And when you look at the history and you know that the two of them married, they were cousins,
right?
And they married each other in order to strengthen his claim to the throne. Right. And that's how he actually becomes king, is because he has the strongest claim. Once it's actually Malcolm I, not Duncan, I believe, in the real history. Once Malcolm I is murdered.
The primogeniture is something we assume to be the case, but primogeniture, that the first son of the king should be the next king, was not necessarily true in Scotland at that time. And the same is true, of course, in Denmark.
Hamlet says he's come between the election and me.
That's right.
Right, because there was sort of a pseudo-democratic process to deciding king. Actually, very much like the Athenian democratic process, was only these people of privilege get a vote.
You mean male citizens?
Yes.
The 30,000 of them that would come to see these plays? Think of that. It's pretty amazing. Actually, there's an endeavor that the U.S. Defense Department has supported called Beyond the Wire, and it's Brian Derry's. This was written up a few years ago. He's been bringing the readings of the Ajax and Philoctetes of Sophocles to military audiences, because the idea is that the Greek audience was male, and they were all warriors. They were all conscripted. They all fought against the Persians. They all fought against the Spartans during the time. And so Greek plays oftentimes speak specifically to the concerns and the post-traumatic stressors that affect modern day warriors. And so there's been a new interest in Greek drama as being narratively connected in some regards to the consequences of being in the war zone. And that American soldiers today are actually hundreds of productions of the Ajax, readings of the Ajax have been done around the country over the past decade as means of kind of expressing some of that post-traumatic situation, because Ajax does commit suicide because of the offense he feels that his colleagues have not recognized his contribution to the war, and that he should have been awarded Achilles' armor, not Ulysses, and so on. So it's interesting that it still has resonance today. And of course, the 20th century, great playwrights of the 20th century, we're talking Arthur Miller, Eugene O'Neill, T.S. Eliot, they all used Greek models for their plays. Morning Becomes Electra, among other things, is Eugene O'Neill.
You can't get any clearer than that.
And O'Neill edited the Greek edition. So great playwrights go back all the time to those Greek models. Now, one thing we haven't really talked about, Stephen, I'd like to bring up here a little bit, is the qualifications of the Earl of Oxford as being someone who would be there to translate those Greek dramas.
Well, that's what I was going to get to next is, okay, so we have what I think you've done a very clear job of establishing, and that is this profound connection to the Greek masters, the Greek classics, through this play and several others. We could go on to other plays. I always reference Titus Andronicus, much to your chagrin, as being, I think, the Earl of Oxford's showing off of his knowledge of Greek mythology because of the consistent allusions that you find in that play. I kind of think that was him just bragging a lot and trying to create his own version of a Greek tragedy. But what we haven't touched on, and where I want to go to now in the program, is who could have possibly had access to this literature and this material, and how?
Okay. I just want to comment that Churton Collins, one of the great turn of the century scholars, writing in the late 19th and early 20th century, completely agrees with your idea about Titus. And he has at least 8 or 10 points of contact between Titus and the Greek drama. So, and he was convinced that Shakespeare must have read the Latin translations of these, somehow got his hands on these continental editions of the Greek plays, which, of course, most American scholars in 20th century scholarship would deny. Robert Root said, no way, he was a Yale University professor, no way was any of the Greek drama influenced Shakespeare's concepts of mythology. And that was echoed over and over again throughout the people who were commenting on the classics and Shakespeare all through the 20th century. And even the early 21st century, Colin Burrow, in his book on Shakespeare and the uses of classical antiquity, makes no reference to the Greek plays. And Jonathan Bate, in his most recent book, How the Classics Made Shakespeare, makes no reference to the Greek drama at all as being influential. So you have
that's
pretty much
ridiculous when Marcus turns to Lavinia and says, "You are a second Philomela." Right? Like, I mean, how more clear can it be? I mean, he basically steals it right out of mythology with her having her hands and tongue cut out after being raped by the sons of Tamra. Like, it's as clear as that. And then, as you mentioned earlier in this particular program today, about Atreus and the serving of the sons at the banquet.
Right.
That's like the most famous scene in Titus Andronicus, when he bakes the two sons into the pie.
Yes. Well, if we can stick a little bit to Aeschylus, because the fact is that Aeschylus's translations were far, far less frequently done than Euripides or Sophocles. There were 2 translations of the Oresteia that were extant throughout Europe. One was the Vittoria edition, and the other was the Sans Revue. I think Sans Revue was published in Basel, and the Vittoria edition was published in Paris. Now, the Sans Revue was actually found in a catalog of Ben Jonson's books. Okay, so Ben Jonson had the Sans Revue translation of the Oresteia. The problem with that is that there was no mention of Agamemnon. He does not appear as a character in that. So you got rid of the first of the three plays of the trilogy, give a little background and choric information about what happened in the Agamemnon, and then it's basically the Choephory or the libation bearers and the Eumenides in that Sans Revue edition, which Ben Jonson had. The Vittoria edition had the complete trilogy, had the Agamemnon included in it. We do know that the Vittoria edition was in William Cecil's personal library. Mildred and William Cecil were both well-versed in the Greeks. In fact, Mildred was said to have known Greek as well as she knew English. And that was a comment from George Buchanan, who was perhaps the greatest Latinist of his era. He was a Scotsman. And he's connected to the Macbeth story, actually, because he tutored both King James and Mary, Queen of Scots. He was their tutor. And he wrote many letters to William Cecil that were later published anonymously that describe scenes that were going on during the assassination of Lord Darnley, Mary Queen of Scots' husband and the father of King James, that find remarkable parallels in the play Macbeth. Those parallels are just amazing. Lillian Winstanley wrote a book about the parallels between the Scottish play and what was actually happening in the 1560s in Scotland, associated with the assassination of Lord Darnley by Bosworth, and the role that Mary Queen of Scots played in the collusion.
Okay, I'm glad you bring that up, because a big legend about the play Macbeth is that it was written for King James. It was written to appease him because he had such an obsession with the dark arts and was such a Puritan when it came to anti-witchcraft and that kind of a thing. That Banquo is an allusion to him becoming King of England someday because he had an ancestor so many generations back named Banquo. And they also then use that, Stratfordians will use that to say Macbeth could not have been written by anyone until 1607 because of the gunpowder plot is mentioned and referenced in the Porter's speech, which is wrong, by the way. It's not what he's talking about, but well,
that's the word equivocator,
right?
And equivocation, that
right.
is the key to that. And that's ridiculous because in 1580, Anthony Munday wrote a long treatise on equivocation, which has to do with a much earlier trial of one of the Jesuits that were Campion. So no, the dating of the play based on the word equivocation and tying that to the gunpowder plot is a completely reconstructed myth that Stratfordians cling to because of their desire to date the plays later. We don't have a date for Macbeth. We don't know when it was written. I think it was written much earlier, obviously. I think probably in the late 1580s. I think that the fact that there was an execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587 is a critical political crisis point. That initiates the Spanish-English War and the sailing of the Armada just a year later. And that war went on for 20 years. So there was a wartime economy. The cost of bread went up 3 times. There were a great deal of hardship. So I think writing plays that pointed out parallels between a character like Lady Macbeth and Mary Queen of Scots would have been politically loaded and perhaps part of the propaganda campaign that they put forward. So I think Macbeth was written much earlier, although we don't have any means of establishing
and of course,
an
Edward
early
de Vere sat on that council. He was a juror in the trial of Mary Queen of Scots.
Right.
And by all accounts, the way I have studied it and found it to be is he was against her execution. And for the specific reason of this, if you can execute an anointed sovereign, you can execute any anointed sovereign. And I think Macbeth is part of that message. Part of that message is don't kill a king or queen. You should not kill a sovereign of a nation anointed by God.
even Queen Elizabeth was very ambivalent about the execution.
And I think for that very same reason, I think she knew if you open that door, you cannot close it.
Right. And of course, it did bring a war that could potentially have been quite catastrophic to England. Fortunately, because of bad weather and good sailing, the English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada repeatedly. It wasn't just one armada. I think the Spaniards sent 4 or 5 different great armadas
flotillas
over the next
left
20
and
years,
right.
but none of them succeeded, obviously.
Yes.
So, but we think of the one great battle,
What I always like to look at the plays is what message are they sending and to whom are they sending? And I think Macbeth, that is definitely one of the messages of Macbeth. And I think drawing upon the Greek references, as you mentioned, lends a strength and credibility. And my process on that would be that he knew his audience would recognize some of those allusions. Don't you think?
I think so, certainly. I think his, art would have been, well, I think he was a court dramatist. Richard Dutton has written a very good book, Shakespeare Court Dramatist. We have much more evidence that his plays were performed at court than ever in the public stage, than at the Globe. So his plays were probably written and rewritten for court production, and they were messages, no doubt about it. I think the idea of royal assassination is something that Shakespeare found universally horrific. And then that would be whether it's Richard II and his murder and the consequences that Henry IV had to bear because of that, or Mary Queen of Scots, or I'm sorry, the assassination of King Duncan, and all these scenarios would have been horrendous. I mean, it represents Shakespeare's connection to the medieval world and to the code of chivalry that I think was in its waning, hours during the time he was writing these plays.
Well, and he definitely had a particular affinity for the Queen and did so much through the canon to continuously legitimize her reign, to legitimize the Tudor dynasty, and in many ways, like with a play like Macbeth, to ensure her safety, because there were countless assassination conspiracies against Elizabeth. When you have the Pope himself saying, "Oh yeah, go ahead, murder her, and I will bless you. I might even saint you if you can murder the heretic queen." I mean, that's pretty intense license right there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You have to counter that in some way. And if you can do it in a way that is this intriguing to people and insert those messages, even if they're subconscious to most of the audience, I think that this guy never did anything arbitrarily, and he never did anything with only one purpose.
I think you brought up the issue of King James and Macbeth, and I think the fact that he wrote a book, Daemonology, in which he expressed very grave concerns about the supernatural phenomenon, and that the role that witches may have played in that, and that he actually oversaw the execution of several witches, that Macbeth would have been terrifying to him. That would have been counterintuitive, that he would have wanted to see a play like this.
I totally agree with that. I think, hell no, this was not written for James. If anything, James probably hated this play.
Absolutely.
If I scared him shitless, because he had a real, true concern about the supernatural. He had a belief in it.
Right.
He believed in ghosts and witches and demons and the evil of Satan and all of that. And I think that you don't write a play like this for a sovereign like that. I think you're just asking for trouble if you do that.
Absolutely.
I don't care how many Banquo references you throw in there.
No, I think so. And if you look at the Earl of Oxford in terms of his personal interest in literature, that when he was young, in 19, he bought a French edition of Plutarch's Lives, which are the basis for so much of the Roman plays, also Timon of Athens. And the characters described in there pepper the plays that in the romances, half the characters are named after Plutarch's heroes that he describes. That he had a copy of Herodotus that we know of, that was an Italian translation. He had Plato in a folio edition. We don't know which edition it was, but his interest in Greek history and Greek philosophy and in Greek drama was unquestioned.
What texts, if any, would he have been able to get his hands on in Greek, in their actual original Greek?
Well, we know he attended the Greek church in Venice in 1575-76. When he attended it, the liturgy would have been in Greek. So we know that he, at least biblical Greek, he could read and understood that. We don't have that he owned any particular Greek plays in his personal library. We just don't have that. We do know that Mildred and William Cecil and Thomas Smith all had Greek editions of the dramas in their personal collections. So he would have lived for many years in the households of people that had those editions. So if we had an inventory of Oxford's books, we'd have a much better idea of that, but we only have a limited idea. But of those that he did purchase, we see a powerful influence of Greek thought in his very youth that he acquired these editions and would have been fascinated by it.
Now, we also know that it was his uncle, Arthur Golding, who translated Ovid's Metamorphosis from the Latin version, correct?
Right.
From the Latin to English.
Right.
Is there any evidence that Golding also had access to the original Greek version doing that translation?
It was originally in Latin, but we do know that Shakespeare, whoever wrote the works of Shakespeare, knew both the Latin and the English, the Golding translation. That he uses the word, the title Titania for the Queen of the Fairies. That comes directly out of the Latin root. A Latin edition of that play, among other things. So there, but Ovid's Metamorphoses was written in Latin originally.
Okay, so what we don't have then is any grasp of what Greek texts Oxford would have used to learn Greek or to have been taught Greek, other than what we can perhaps surmise from Mildred Cecil and William Cecil's collection.
I think that's true, although I think that there is strong evidence that he studied the Greek Bible during his youth, and that would have been something he would have, why he would have attended the Greek church in Venice.
Well, and we know Mildred was an extreme Puritan and ran her household very strict, and I can only assume that must have meant that that's where he got some of the early training as far as, this is what the good book says.
Well, his tutors, were impressed by his intelligence. And of course, if you read the series of books that were dedicated to him, of which there were almost 30, frequently he gets referred to as an Alexander the Great. I think there's 7 or 8 of the dedications to him that include comparisons of him to Alexander the Great, who was a great...
That clinches it. He's, there it is. The Earl of Oxford can trace his lineage to Hercules. Wow. That figures it right there.
That's right. And that's why Mark Twain says, when you see mouse tracks through Stratford, that means that Hercules was there.
There you go. That's exactly it. See, Twain was so far ahead of himself.
Well, if you look at that Shakespeare alludes to Hercules, I think 35 times in the canon. I did actually study of this one time. I cataloged them and I tried to find, using Robert Graves' mythology book, where these references would have come from, where these allusions to Hercules' various labors and the other events in his life.
He refers to his Massey Club several times.
Well, of course. But if you look about that, he derived his mythology of Hercules from Ovid, from Lucian, from a dozen different Greek sources that were just astonishing. From Apollodorus, from Diodorus, he was widely read to have put all these allusions to Hercules together. Now, Hercules does not occur in Macbeth, but he does occur 3 or 4 times in Hamlet, and allusions to Hercules and Antony and Cleopatra, and a handful of other plays where he shows up quite frequently. So Shakespeare was very familiar with a wide reading of Greek literature, including the collection of mythology that was in the Apollodorus collection. So we don't know that he bought that book anywhere or how he managed to get a hold of it, but I'm sure that he did, and he was inspired by it. Can you imagine, again, the thrill of being one of the cutting edge playwrights who's bringing back all those Greek elements back into his art? among one of the things he does is he uses stickomythic dialogue, where the one-liner back and forth between two characters. That's a very Greek element, and there's a fair amount of that in Macbeth. Timon of Athens has quite a bit of stickomythic dialogue too. So there are several plays that tend to have a little bit more of that kind of dialogue, and that's a very Greek quality also.
Even Bottom references Hercules.
And the thing is that Greeks did write politically loaded plays. Most people don't think of it this way, but Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King by Sophocles, who is, of course, that narrative, that myth is the basis for Freud's theories, was written as a political criticism of Pericles for starting the Peloponnesian War.
Sophocles, doesn't Sophocles get ostracized? He gets banished for it, wasn't it?
No, he wasn't.
Which is the Greek playwright who gets banished?
Phrynius, I think, for writing something about the Persian Wars. He was fined what amounts to about a year's salary for the offending the Greek family. So you had to write metaphorically for the Greeks. The same thing with Shakespeare. You had to be a little bit clever, unless you were writing comedies. And Aristophanes was as bold a critic of society and in-your-face satirist as anybody in modern
It's funny because
culture.
Earlier you mentioned that the U.S. military is behind the readings or productions of Ajax, and I wonder when will they start with Lysistrata, I wonder.
When there's a female commander-in-chief.
Yes. Then Lysistrata will be performed in front of our troops across the globe. That'll be interesting.
That could save the world.
Yes, it could. But there's you just can't do that play without nudity, though.
Oh, well, Aristophanes was very bold on it. It's a distraction from this, but in the birds, you see the images of the birds on Greek vases. They're all running around with erect, huge Greek phalluses.
Yes.
Besides the wings and the beaks, there were giant phalluses on these characters.
Yes,
so the Greeks were very bold in their connection between art and politics. And mostly they did this through the representations of mythology. And Shakespeare uses that same technique. And he hides his political content sometimes behind those kind of metaphoric parallels, but they're indelibly written in there. And as an Oxfordian, I think you can appreciate these things far more than you can if you were thinking that some, person from rural England had put all this together. I just don't believe that's possible.
Well, Earl, I would say you have done enough study on this particular area of study, the influence of the Greeks on the Shakespearean canon, that you need to write a book.
I'll tell you what, I could put together some essays, but
you've written enough papers on enough of the plays and enough of the different influences, and you know more about Greek literature than most anybody I've ever known or met or come across in my lifetime. And I think you could probably cobble a book together just off of the things that you have written and published over the years on this subject. And it would be a fascinating read that would, I think, change the paradigm to some degree with regards to how much the Greeks truly did influence this writer, and then open the door to even more study of how is it possible that this writer could have gotten his hands and had access to this literature in order to be so influenced by it.
I think that it's a very hot issue in contemporary Shakespeare studies, and that Professor Pollard, as I mentioned earlier, took a deep look at Euripides, and she cites 3 of my articles in her award-winning book. And so I have established.
Is she your new scholar crush? Is that
she's my muse?
Yeah.
She is on the Shakespeare Undiscovered series that she does some interviews with Christopher Plummer and other actors in that series that PBS puts together. So you can get an idea of who she is, but she's definitely cracked the case wide open on Euripides. And in writing to her, and she has corresponded with me in recent months about Macbeth and the Oresteia. She is a graduate student who's actually working on that problem right now, that question. And I think it's intriguing and problematic from the standpoint of the traditional interpretation of that Shakespeare had no Greek. He definitely had Greek. And yes, Stephen, I will, once I've tackled Titus, I will come at you with a full...
You can't do it without Titus. You cannot do it without Titus.
No.
And I'm going to continue to push Titus upon you. And I will say this is another aspect. This is a topic for a whole nother episode in the future, but I will push this upon you. One of the other really interesting and intriguing aspects of Titus, besides all of the Greek allusion and Greek references and the fact that it, as I say, it is his homage to the Greeks, is it's also a very Judeo-Christian play. And the parallels there make for some very interesting study as well. Because, like, for instance, Titus, the name Titus, he chooses Titus because Titus was the Roman emperor who defeated Judea. Right. Lucius, Titus's son, who ends up becoming emperor, was the name of the first Christian king of England. So there's a very interesting Old Testament, New Testament thing that happens in that play that is layered on top of all of this Greek tragedy, eye for an eye, revenge, life for a life type of thing. So you got to dig into Titus.
Well, Steve and I take your challenge seriously.
Very good.
I will come back at you soon.
Very good. It's, as always, Earl, it's been a fascinating conversation. I can't wait until you get Professor Pollard to visit us here in Southern Oregon. I'm sure that will be coming very soon. And maybe we can get her on an episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Don't forget, if you haven't already, you can stream all the episodes from your favorite streaming location. And if your streaming location allows you to rate and review the show, we would love for you to give us your 5 stars, your thumbs up, or whatever it may be. Draw us to the top of programs that involve Shakespeare and Shakespeare studies. If you'd like to learn more about the Shakespeare authorship question or the Oxfordian position, please visit ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org is your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship. You can get your Quiller swag. Go to don'tquillthepodcast.com. Don'tquillthepodcast.com. Go to the store, buy a coffee mug or a t-shirt, and represent. Be the quiller that you are. We want to thank you for joining us for this episode. Be sure to catch new episodes every other Wednesday at dragonwagonradio.com. Don't forget, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.